Well, it looks like it's becoming, sort of understood in the mainstream now that this lockdown really is coming tomorrow. What started as a rumor that I was hearing, midway through this week is now becoming pretty apparent because, we're seeing the National Guard pop up all over the country in places like Baltimore, and Chicago, and of course you see these trains going by, and there are people arguing over whether or not these trains with Humvees on them are unusual or not, because of course the military does move things around the country anyway, under normal circumstances. So obviously, every time you see, a Humvee either on the road or on a train getting moved around, that's not indicative of incoming martial law. But considering everything that's going on right now, when you see large movements of military equipment going towards major population centers, that gives you a pretty good hint of what's about to go down. And of course, another state now, New Jersey, has locked itself down. And of course, all these states really that are doing it, they're not, when they're issuing this shelter-in-place order, they're not saying, hey, if you leave your house, we're going to come and kill you, like they do it in China. It's not quite to that same level of authoritarianism yet. But again, as I was saying before, I think that the reason is that the resources are not in place for them to be able to enforce it. In certain parts of the country, they'll never be able to enforce it because it's just too, too sparsely populated. And so we may not be able to do, as I've been saying, on the lines of France and Italy and Spain, you're not going to necessarily have a full nationwide lockdown with total martial law everywhere, because that's just not, it's not physically possible. But you'll have something probably more like what China actually did. Because remember, China never went as far as France and Italy have gone. China never tried to lock down their entire country because, like I said, even for China, which is already a police state, they could not do that. They do not. There's not enough resources to, keep people that oppressed for that long across such a wide swath of territory. And so what you could expect is that, Trump is still something that people, I don't think are picking up on as much. Actually, it's something that the Democrats are very upset with Trump for, is that he's emphasizing, the role of the states in all of this, and saying that how, he's kind of leading from behind, and that, the state governors are the ones really in charge of this. And what he's doing is he's empowering them to take actions like, Gavin Newsom of California have taken, and Cuomo and the governor of New Jersey, and these other governors, empowering them to take more extreme moves in locking down their states. And so I think what you'll have is that in certain areas, you will see the governors leading this and setting their own policy within their own state of how strict the lockdown is going to be. But to a certain extent, the whole country will be locked down. It will be to varying degrees across the country. Your major cities like LA, Chicago, New York, these are all going to be like Wuhan-style quarantines. At least that's the way things are shaping up. That's the way things are looking. Because, again, it's possible when you have a city like New York to where, there are major choke points. Most of New York City is on, islands that can just be cut off from the mainland. And so, throughout the country, you will be seeing the government instituting the level of control that it is capable of. You don't want the government doesn't want to bluff here and then end up looking stupid, because if they, for example, in rural Wyoming, declare, okay, nobody's allowed to leave their house, and then there's videos on Twitter or Facebook or something of people having, house parties and everyone, getting together in the neighborhood, and well, not a neighborhood if you're in a rural area, but, people out doing whatever they want, it'll make it look like the government's orders have no teeth, and that folks are just doing whatever they want, because, of course, in that context, they would. So it's much better to tell those people, hey, you can do whatever you want, but the people in the densely populated areas, you're the ones on lockdown. And those of us, in more suburban type areas, to where, you live in a house, you're not in an apartment building in a densely populated city, but you're also not on 40 acres or even 5 acres. I don't know necessarily what sort of control that you're going to see instituted in those sorts of areas, but of course we would imagine it's somewhere in between. Now, the course over this whole Sunday lockdown thing is growing. Today, I don't know if it's just, nerves or whatever, but it seems to me like this seems more real. The potential for this Sunday lockdown, because of course, it's hard to see them going a whole nother week without stricter restrictions. Of course, last Sunday was when we saw the first state, Ohio, declare that all bars and restaurants would be closed. And now pretty much everywhere in the country, all bars and restaurants are closed, at least in the major population centers. If you look at the parts of America where there are people, like I was saying before, those states have all instituted what at this time last week had not occurred anywhere. And, it's good to institute these sorts of, very extreme things like, let's say, a total lockdown on a Sunday because nobody's out anyway. Sunday night is when most people in the country, when the most amount of people are home and not, out in public. You don't want to institute this on a Wednesday night, for example, in the middle of the work week and just tell everyone, hey, don't show up tomorrow. That creates too much chaos. But people are already in weekend mode. And if on Sunday night you come out and say, hey, the weekend's going to continue for another, 8 months, it just makes it that much easier to transition because people are already, at home and not at work. So the military, as I said earlier, is like the regular military, not just the National Guard, is moving in to certain areas. New York now, of course, like many of us have been saying, is the most notable example where you have the Army moving in. You've got the Army Corps of Engineers coming and commandeering certain facilities. They're going to start turning, hotels into improvised hospitals. They're going to probably build, these big improvised hospitals just out of nothing, out of tents, kind of like what you see in China. I believe there was also a couple of leaked pictures from a convention center in Dallas that had been set up with lots of just rows and rows of beds, very much reminiscent of pictures of the Spanish flu. We've seen that to where, you had these big, I don't know, I guess in the 19-teens, they wouldn't have been airplane hangars, maybe just big barns, I guess, filled with rows and rows and rows of beds. This is by no means unprecedented in human history. It's just that, now it's occurring at a time when the government is used to so much control and guaranteeing so much safety from people to where, the possibility that someone might get sick is really scary. And people feel like the government should protect them from that. So the government is empowered to take these very extreme measures because, it's almost what people expect of them. In fact, the mainstream media's criticism of Trump, who they've compared to Adolf Hitler in the past, has not been that he's, too oppressive with all of his measures and that he's basically, assuming dictatorial power. Their complaint is that he's not been enough of a dictator, that he's not taking enough of a lead role in this, that he's not going around Congress and all of the state governors enough, that he hasn't overthrown the civilian governments in most states and replaced them with military administration, i.e. martial law. There have been numerous op-eds I believe most notably in The Hill, but also in places like New York Times and Washington Post. I believe I've also read similar pieces where you have, members of the pseudo-intellectual class in the media, begging Trump to lock down the country, begging him to take away the civil liberties of everyone, which again, this is a part of their sort of I don't know if the right term is cosmopolitan bias or at least urban bias, to where they're looking at this as a perspective from someone who lives in a high-rise in New York City, to where they see things spreading very quickly, and this being a very immediate danger to them, and saying, hey, everyone needs to be locked in their apartment for a month. But they want to institute that same sort of response across the entire country. It's just not reasonable. And this is something that, again, people like Cuomo don't seem to understand. That you want to take a bit of a moderated approach and institute different solutions in different places. Because the second biggest threat, I think, to the U.S. government coming out of this whole crisis, after the economic problems, which I'll get to later, is the threat of rebellion from too hard of a crackdown, because that's what happens if a government cracks down too hard, too fast, and doesn't, boil the frog, so to speak. What happens is the frog jumps out of the pot. And you end up with all these militias who have been training for decades. This is a very strong culture in America of people who have been expecting at some point in history, in our lifetimes, some president will declare martial law and will seize power, dictatorial power, and erode our civil liberties. And a lot of people have been waiting for this sort of a thing for a long time. So you don't want to give them a good reason to strike out. And if you do, you want them to be able to fail. You don't want to, you don't want them to have popular support. In other words, you don't want to have scenes like you have coming out of Wuhan and out of the rest of China of, poor people screaming and begging for their lives as the police take them and throw them in the back of a paddy wagon to be hauled off to the Kuf camp. As I've said over and over again, the first time that happens in the U.S., again, it's going to be pandemonium. People will be frightened, not so much of the virus at that point, but more of the government's response, because that's a big balance here that you have to maintain. The government, in order to maintain the ability to lock things down, they have to have popular support, if that makes sense. They have to have, it has to be consensual oppression. Because that's key, is making sure that the virus is scarier than your response. That's what you have to do. You need to keep up fear of the virus. Because if you don't, people will become scared, and then as soon as the militias start rebelling, people will support them morally, if not materially. I mean, the U.S. government has a terrible history when it comes to fighting against insurgencies. They lost against the Viet Cong. They lost against the Taliban. I guess you could say that they won against the Sunni insurgency in Iraq. Kind of, not really. And they did finally defeat. I guess that the one insurgency that they truly defeated was the insurgency in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, when you had Filipinos who wanted independence rather than becoming a colony of America after the Spanish were kicked out by the Americans, but that cost the U.S. a lot of blood and treasure. There were, that was one of the main reasons why the U.S. switched back to a .45 caliber handgun from a .38 caliber, because they thought that the .38 wasn't strong enough to stop these Filipinos, because they'd kept running at them, And so all these bloody, very, costly counterinsurgency operations that the U.S. has conducted around the world, haven't been great for, but the U.S. has been able to weather them, because at the end of the day, the U.S. could at any time quit and come home, and the insurgency was over. But if they start an insurgency like that and provoke one, within its own borders, well, then there's no escaping that. And the more aggressive you are, especially if it's with your own people, the more credibility you will lose amongst your own people, the more that you will alienate people and delegitimize yourself, if the U.S. military turns its guns on regular Americans. So that's why this lockdown, out of necessity, has to be very limited. And frankly, I don't know if the president really knows the extent to how risky a lockdown like this could be, but for whatever reason, his instincts are pushing him towards the direction of moderation here. Certainly, he's being much more moderate about it than the media would like him to be. The media is definitely demanding very radical solutions. They are, demanding that Trump become a quote-unquote wartime president. Well, in case you haven't checked, throughout most of American history, being a wartime president means you're a dictator. Abraham Lincoln, FDR, Woodrow Wilson, these guys did really, un-American stuff to people. They threw innocent folks in prison just for disagreeing with the war. They put, American citizens in camps because they had the wrong, background, the wrong ethnicity, the wrong last name. And, of course, one of them even suspended habeas corpus, which, of course, Trump would have to, too, if we really decided to, declare war on the American people. So all in all, a national lockdown would carry a tremendous risk of Kufers rising up. And so even if you could say a national lockdown might stop the spread of the virus and save lives that way, it may very well cost lives in other ways and, of course, do much more damage to the credibility of the United States government or even endanger it completely. Now, moving on to the economic aspect, I would just want to revisit this a bit because things are changing. I thought I would bring up the comparison of the Soviet Union in 1991 when it collapsed. The demise of the Soviet Union was not because of any kind of military defeat or anything like that, or because their government wasn't powerful enough. It was because their economy was rotten to the core, and eventually was very weak, and so the slightest wind came and blew, and they fell over. And obviously, the economy of the Soviet Union, being a full communism, was different, let's say, than the current situation of the United States, but they both have in common that the central government has been propping up their economy, trying to prevent all economic pain for decades, and has created a lot of internal weaknesses because of it. And so, the situation we find ourselves in really is, the Federal Reserve's last stand. This is, the last this is the last-ditch effort to save the whole American system from collapsing. Because, don't get me wrong, if the Fed, because it is all the Fed, because the government's out of money, the government is $23 trillion in debt. It's not like the government could just, take tax revenue and bail out everyone that needs to be bailed out, or, issue bonds and bail out everyone that needs to be bailed out. Because if the government, for example, issued bonds, and tried to borrow money, without any help from the Fed, just from the open market, interest rates would skyrocket, and the U.S. government would immediately be bankrupted because the interest rate on 23 trillion plus or something in debt, because I see 23 now because I believe we were at 21 trillion before, and now they're talking about a $2 trillion stimulus package just for starters. The interest on that at any rate above substantially above zero would bankrupt the U.S. There's no doubt about it. And so the only way for any of this to work out is for the Fed to monetize the U.S. government's debt and monetize the entire economy, because now it's not just the U.S. government that has to issue a lot of debt here. The U.S. government is trying to bail out everyone else who's also very deeply in debt, because if you don't bail out each and every single one of these folks, they will start a cascade effect to where it brings down the entire financial system, because everyone is so over-levered that even the slightest tremor, impacting their balance sheet and their cash flow, such as this, which is a magnitude 10 earthquake, the complete shutdown of the U.S. economy, that will bankrupt everyone. And then, of course, if you do that, you end up like the Soviet Union, where everything comes apart. The United States of America would cease to exist, which is not something that has been outside the realm of possibility, as far as I'm concerned. I thought that considering the structural risks that we had, that has been a very high risk, even before the virus, because I just thought that a regular recession would be enough to bring down, potentially, the U.S. economy. And the only hope that we have right now is that all this money printing will not create hyperinflation or anything like that, but rather will be able to successfully bail everyone out. And so just so you know, the key factor here that will determine whether this Fed put, the final Fed put, is able to kick the can down the road, because of course it can't save America forever, but it can kick the can down the road, is if this money that is going to have to be printed to bail everyone out, if that money is just sort of sat on, if that money doesn't make its way into the real economy. Because it's when, money makes its way into the economy, is actually spent and is used to purchase real goods, that you get inflation. Because then all of a sudden you have, more money chasing the same amount of goods. And if you have that, that's when the supply of money increases, against a constant demand, and so therefore you have a fall in the price. Well, in this case, it's even worse, because we have a complete drop-off in the U.S. economy. The economy has come to a halt, fallen off a cliff. You're going to have a rise in the supply of money against a falling demand for money. And of course, instead of bailing out, just the big banks, like was done in 2008, the administration has made it clear they intend to bail out everyone, Main Street as well as Wall Street. And of course, it's the folks on Main Street who actually spend their money in the real economy. Folks on Wall Street can just go take their money and buy stocks. They don't need to go out and buy consumer goods with it. But that's exactly, what the Main Street folks would do. Now, additionally, the one other possible saving grace is that because there's so much dollar-denominated debt outside of the U.S., that's why actually right now you're seeing the value of the dollar in the foreign exchange markets rise so much, is because companies outside the U.S. need to buy dollars to pay down their debts. Something else that can happen is that if a bunch of dollars are printed and injected into the economy, that all of those are just spent on imports. And since the international market seems to have such a strong, thirst for dollars right now, that also would alleviate the chances of super big inflation. And so whether or not this whole operation will lead to high inflation, let alone hyperinflation, is up in the air. And the only reason why I say it's up in the air is because they managed to do it in 2008. Now, this is obviously more aggressive and more dangerous than what they did in 2008. It's more money. It's more broad across the economy. It's going directly to consumers. It's helicopter money. But I have to maintain some level of modesty here, or open-mindedness, and understand that there might be things that I'm missing. So, I really haven't heard anyone that has made a convincing case one way or the other that this will or will not cause significant inflation, the likes of which, of course, once inflation kicks off, it's never, once the inflation genie is out of the bottle, as Peter Schiff would say, it's not being put back in. And so at that point, it's game over. Because we're almost basically game over right now, but there is a chance that if everything is saved, that is, if the Fed can somewhat, use all this money printing just to push the pause button on our economy until the virus crisis is over, which is going to be a long time, potentially 18 to 24 months, at least there will be some light at the end of the tunnel. But, if we do get inflation, which, again, very high probability, that's what we're waiting for here, we'll see in the next few months, because of course it takes time once all the money's printed and injected in. That to me is the real end game. That is going to be the lasting legacy of this whole virus, more so, of course, than the lives which are going to be lost, which will be tragic. But the historical impact of this event will pivot on whether or not the Fed is able to create a lot of inflation, which is pretty boring, you would think. You have this juicy global pandemic, virus killing thousands of people, and yet it all comes down to monetary policy and monetary theory. But that's just how important these issues are. I mean, this is the core of economics, is monetary theory. Actually, I would say the core of economics is value theory, but money is the core of the economy. That's the foundation. That is what determines so much of how an economy operates. So with that said, if you folks gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, and I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.